we now take a look at our special report today, now ahead of the presentation of the 2019-2020 national budget this Thursday. New Vision TV continues with a series stressing Uganda's economic performance using the budgets since 1986.
Yesterday, we focused on the government's rocky start in 1986. The country was broke, and the finance minister, then Professor Ponsiano Mulema, had to grope around for money. Those were desperate days. Looking back makes today even better. In today's part, we focus on how the government took some radical measures to turn the economy around. In the 1987-88 budget, new Finance Minister Crispus Chiyonga reported that the tarmacking of the Mityana Mubende Fort Portal Road and the rehabilitation of the Kampala International Hotel was thanks to barter deals over crops, most likely coffee. Both projects were undertaken by Energy Growth Project, a contractor from Yugoslavia, then still a single country in Eastern Europe. Yugoslavia is long off the world map after it imploded, giving birth to Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Macedonia, and Montenegro. People refer with mockery to the NRM's barter trade days, but these were a response to a difficult situation, and the arrangements were never intended to be a permanent way of trading with world markets. Chiyonga reported in that budget that the country was suffering severe balance of payments problems, with inflows from abroad outweighed by the outflows to pay for debt repayments, imported goods and services. He said the balance of payments position had deteriorated to minus $58.5 million in 1984 from $32.9 million in 1982. He was speaking in 1987, and one can expect this position had worsened by then. This may be a small figure when seen against our present reality, but the 1984 negative position was 30% of our total exports in 1986. The barter trade was a stopgap measure to get the economy back on its feet as they negotiated for aid from the donor community. Barter trade didn't last because Uganda was not producing anything in the volumes or of the quality to pay potential suppliers of capital goods and equipment needed to rehabilitate industries and infrastructure. Another desperate measure taken was the currency reform of 1987, which looped off 2 zeros and charged a 30% tax on all liquid assets, while controversial, had the double benefit to the government of raising badly needed revenue through the levying of the 30% tax and reducing the money in circulation to that extent. If one had 1 million shillings, 2 zeros were dropped, making it 10,000. And after a 30% tax, it became 7,000.
This budget, just as this budget was being done, or shortly before this budget was being done, they had a currency reform. And the currency reform involved removing 2 zeros from the currency at the time. So, if you had a budget of 1.1 trillion the year before, it should be about 10 billion. In this year that we're talking about. That's why the figures shifted so dramatically.
Another controversial initiative was the liberalization of the trade in foreign exchange through the legalizing of forex bureaus, a decision that was taken in the 1990-1991 budget. Prior to this, to get hard currency legally, one had to apply to the Bank of Uganda. Because of the serious need for this hard currency for essential imports, the central bank prioritized the little foreign currency they had for imports of plant and machinery, medicines and agriculture imports at a prescribed official rate, which barely reflected the reality in the market. The world price of coffee had shed $1 between 1986 and 1990 when Chiyonga reported the country's crop had fetched an average of $1.25, sending our coffee exports receipts plummeting by 60% during the period. So liberalizing the market was a counterintuitive maneuver intended to attract more hard currency into the country as the shilling became fully convertible. It was evident the significant amounts were changing hands on the Chibanda market. Why not bring them out into the open and tax them as well? In light of the competing demands for its resources, government finally decided it could no longer hold up the coffee sector, and in his 1991-1992 budget speech, Chiong announced that the state monopoly Coffee Marketing Board had been disbanded and 4 coffee unions authorized to export coffee. By this time, our coffee prices on the world market had fallen below $1 a kilo, and clearly farmers were voting with their feet, leading to reduction in coffee exported to 2 million bags from the previous year's 2.3 million bags. With this one stroke, government stopped trying to fight the market by trying to pay farmers better than the world market would allow, passed on the burden to the private sector.
Interestingly, at the time, something we don't do now, we used to tax coffee exports. In fact, coffee export tax revenues accounted for 80% of the budget of the revenues we collected.
Wow.
Coffee alone. So it was in our interest that we export as much coffee as we can. So if we don't, our budget would suffer. And that's why also we had to cut back on our budget. The revenues from coffee just didn't come in.
Against criticism that there was sounding the death knell of the coffee industry, it caught a second wind, and the liberalization was just in time to take advantage of a coffee boom, the type the industry had not seen since 1976. Next, a new finance minister steps on the stage. Joash Mayanja Nkanji, in his maiden 1992-1993 speech, lamented that just when they thought they had got inflation under control, the previous year's budget, that was heavily reliant on donor support, which did not materialize, had forced the government's hand. The opening of the taps led to a 51% increase in money in circulation. As a result, inflation jumped to 63% from the previous year's 29%. To correct the error, government took drastic actions, including cutting the budget by 17%, which cut was applied only to the fourth quarter of the 1991-1992. He introduced the Treasury bill auction as a means to mop up excess liquidity and boosted efforts to improve revenue collections. The government's measures worked better than anticipated. That in the next year, Mayanja Nkanji was proud to announce that inflation had plummeted to minus 1.3%. Inflation is never to reach the late 1992 levels of 40% until 19 years later, when inflation peaked at 30% in October 2011 due to a combination of regional drought and election campaign-related expansion of money in circulation. With the taming of inflation through controlling government expenditure and the use of treasury bills and bonds to mechanically suck money out of circulation, government has been able to consistently hit its target of 5% annual inflation since. This has had its downside as government has expanded its borrowing from the public. But the central bank is adamant that in the absence of increased productivity in the economy, their use of monetary instruments will continue in defense against inflation. The critics say that the government is crowding out the private sector and is solely responsible for high lending rates that obtain in the market today. In an attempt to bring down lending rates, government embarked on the controversial sale of the Uganda Commercial Bank, whose branch expansion to 136 at one time increased lending to rural farmers, and a crude attempt at crony capitalism almost failed the country's biggest lender.